Nothing like a good old-fashioned moral panic, is there? As of the time I'm shooting this, 26 states here in the United States have taken steps to ban the teaching of critical race theory in public education. 9 states have actually enacted such bans. And if you're watching this video thinking, that sounds bad, I guess, but I don't really know what critical race theory is, don't worry, because the people who want to ban it don't know what it is either. Critical race theory, or CRT, is a loose academic framework under which scholars and activists explore the history and present-day reality of systemic racism in America. It originated in the 1970s through the work of legal scholars who examined how racism intersects with the law. I'm certainly no expert in it. I'd never even heard the term until last year. From what I can tell, CRT is a pretty diverse field of study, including multiple methodologies and philosophies, concerning itself with a variety of subjects and practiced by scholars from different schools of thought who don't always agree with each other. But for as broad as it is, CRT still has boundaries. It's a specific, defined concept. Unless you're Donald Trump, or Ted Cruz, or Matt Gaetz, or any one of dozens of right-wing politicians and commentators who have spent months whipping up hysteria over it. To them, CRT is just another label they can slap on things they perceive as threats to their agendas, things that make them feel uncomfortable, or things they just don't like. So when a conservative politician talks about CRT, he or she, definitely or she, is usually talking about any narrative or argument or suggestion that frames racism, white supremacy, as a systemic problem. Because understanding racism as systemic requires us to admit that racism is not the result of a few racists running around doing racist things independently while everything else is fine. Systemic racism means that racism exists in our laws and culture and social structures. It means that racism is pervasive. It exists not just in the hearts and minds of a handful of misguided people, but in the institutions that shape and govern our society. And here's the thing about that. As atheist know-it-alls like myself used to say about evolution when arguing with creationists, that's not just a theory, it's a fact. Slavery existed on this continent for over 150 years when the American Revolution began. It was written into our Constitution. It shaped the drafting of that Constitution. It was protected and perpetuated by legislation upheld by the courts. And in 1861, a third of the states went to war against the rest of the country to defend it. When slavery ended following the Civil War, Jim Crow laws were enacted throughout the old Confederacy, laws which remained in force for a century, legalizing racial discrimination and imposing brutal and dehumanizing inequality on generations of Black Americans. The incredible thing is, these facts aren't disputed by most Republicans. They admit that slavery and segregation existed and were bad. They just don't see why they should reflect badly on the country. The leaders of this anti-CRT crusade, like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene or Senator Ted Cruz or Senator Josh Hawley, the abominable dipshit who cheered on the January 6 insurrectionists until they started getting arrested, then acted like he'd never heard of them, like to say that their vision of America is rooted in a belief in the fundamental goodness of the country, that they're about optimism and positivity. Because, as we all remember, the prevailing feeling of the Trump administration was positivity. They don't want to talk about the fact that slavery was legal when the Constitution was written. They'd rather talk about how our nation was conceived in liberty. Sure, we've fallen short of that ideal a time or two, but hey, we're fallible humans. Come on, what do you want? Few hundred years of slavery. Nobody's perfect. Instead of dwelling on the fact that we had slavery, they'd prefer to focus on the fact that we abolished slavery. Instead of focusing on Jim Crow and segregation and other forms of legalized discrimination, they'd rather celebrate the fact that we ended those policies. But that doesn't really work, does it? If slavery and Jim Crow were just regrettable aberrations rather than colossal moral failings, why is it such a big deal that we got rid of them? To put it in language most of these shitheads can understand, it's like claiming redemption when you haven't confessed the sin. And that's assuming that the outlawing of racial discrimination in the 1960s spelled the end of racism, which it didn't. The same Republicans who are insisting that institutionalized racism doesn't exist are also working to further institutionalize racism by enacting election reforms in states across the country designed to stop Black Americans and members of other marginalized groups from voting, which makes the Republican opposition to what they call critical race theory seem less like honest though wrong-headed patriotism and more like willful lies told to justify their subversion of democracy. But let's get back to critical race theory, or what the instigators of this moral panic are calling critical race theory anyway, because one of the most puzzling things about it is how these Republicans talk about it as though it's brand new, as though it's this radical thing being forced into public school curricula all of a sudden, as though students haven't been learning about the racist history of this country for decades already. I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that the way students have been taught about the history of racism in the United States has always been good or sufficient. It hasn't. But look, I'm 41. I went to public school in the 1980s and 90s. That's where I first heard about the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Act and the Dred Scott decision. It's also where I learned about the forced relocation of Native American tribes, the Trail of Tears, the so-called Indian Wars, and it's where I learned about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And it's where I learned about the separate but equal doctrine, and Brown versus the Board of Education, and the Civil Rights Movement, and the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act. I was taught about all of those things in public school, and my teachers weren't Marxists. They weren't revolutionaries. They weren't trying to divide us based on race or make us feel bad for being white, which nearly all of us were, including the teachers. I never had a black teacher in primary or secondary school and only had one black professor in college, but that's a whole nother problem. They weren't teaching us to hate our country. They weren't necessarily teaching us to be critical of our country either. Like I said, I'm not holding up my education as a model of how it should be. And if I looked back at what I was taught, how I was taught it, and what I wasn't taught, I'm certain I'd find all kinds of problems. But we learned that acknowledging the failures of your country is not the same as hating your country. The Ted Cruzes and Josh Hawleys and Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Donald Trumps of the world are attacking what they call critical race theory because they say it teaches students to hate their country. But how is it hating your country to demand better from it? What is a country, if not the people living in it? How is it un-American to say millions of our people are still being brutalized and demeaned and oppressed by institutionalized racism, and that's wrong and should be stopped? How is it more patriotic for a white person to whine about being labeled an oppressor than to say this oppression is intolerable no matter which side of it you're on, and we need to do something about it? The leaders of the movement to ban what they call CRT are peddling a fantasy. It's nothing new. It's the same fantasy conservatives, and way too many liberals too, by the way, have been selling and eagerly buying into since this country was founded. It's the fantasy of the land of the free and the home of the brave, the greatest nation on earth, the place where there are no ceilings, where anyone can rise as high as talent and hard work can take them. It's a nice idea. It would be wonderful if it were true, and that's what makes it so seductive. It's not reality. It's never been reality, but some people are so attached to the fantasy that they are unable or unwilling to perceive the United States any other way. When that fantasy is threatened, they want their leaders to protect it, to defend it, even to the point of using the power of the state to impose it on everyone. And their leaders see that. They see that desire, that need to maintain the fantasy, and they use that to keep the people on their side, to get what they want. Ignorance is bliss. The problem is, you've got to be ignorant to enjoy it. The likes of Trump and Cruz and Hawley and Green and those who support them might be content with hollow patriotism, national pride that's ultimately based on nothing. Some of us would rather work to make this a country we can actually be proud of.